All right. Thank you, everyone. That was quite a breathtaking, breathless day 5. We've just heard from Indra Nui, our second keynote speaker for the Smart Protein Summit. And as I said earlier, we're very grateful for Indra's time and for all the insights that she's shared about how alternative protein can be a key lever as we build back up in a post-COVID world. I'm deeply excited and very gratified at this next session. And I'm looking forward to having a chat with all of these panelists. I'm not going to do a very big preamble for this one, nor a heavy introduction to our panelists. I'm just going to go ahead and say this is really going to be very, very instructive as we think through possible pathways to market and growth over the next decade for alternative smart protein over the rest of the world as well as India. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panel now. Firstly, Elaine Xu, Managing Director of the Good Food Institute, APAC. Hi, Elaine.
Hello.
Gustavo Guadagnini, Managing Director of the Good Food Institute, Brazil. Hi, Gus.
Hello.
Nir Goldstein, Managing Director of Good Food Institute, Israel. Hi, Nir.
Shalom, everyone.
Richard Parr, Managing Director of the Good Food Institute, Europe. Hey, Richard.
Thanks.
And Bruce Friedrich, co-founder and Executive Director of the Good Food Institute based in the US. Hey, Bruce.
Hey, Varun. Hey, everybody.
All right. So as I said, I'm deeply excited, grateful for everyone's time as we think through some of these questions that are very important for the next decade and what may happen with smart protein all over the world. I'm going to do this session a little bit differently to make sure that we get insights from everyone. We're going to do a bit of a rapid fire session, and I'm sure the time is going to fly. So can we get the clock up on the board, please? All right, so the way this is going to work for all of you is I'm going to say how many minutes you have to answer each of these questions, and then you with your brilliant minds and all of your insights can tell us everything that you know. Bruce, I'll start with you. We have 3 minutes on the clock for this one. You kicked off much of this with GFI US's establishment in 2016. What are some major differences between the industry now and then across science, business, and policy?
Sure. Thank you very much, Varun. And I've been sitting in through a fair amount of this conference and have really enjoyed it. I think you've done a truly phenomenal job putting the panels together, and all of the moderators and the panelists have been insightful and very exciting. Yeah, so thinking about smart protein now as opposed to smart protein 5 years ago, across the 3 areas that GFI focuses on, which we think are the 3 critical areas. So you've got science and technology, you've got policy, and you've got corporate engagement, which spans startup to big corporation. And really across all of these, everything is different. So 5 years ago, there was absolutely nothing by way of a landscape analysis of the science of plant-based or cultivated meat. And now you have every year more and more open access science being produced and more scientists going into this field, tissue engineers, plant biologists, chemical engineers, electrical engineers, all the people we need to create this industry. On the policy front, 5 years ago, one government had ever in history put money into plant-based or cultivated meat, open access R&D. Now we're seeing governments all over the world creating essentially a space race focused on food because they recognize all of the external costs of industrial meat consumption, and they recognize that it's in their interest to fund this transition. So we're seeing that sort of everywhere. Nobody globally had looked at what it looks like to create the regulatory path forward for cultivated meat. And now we see a bunch of governments diving in, most notably probably the United States, a joint agreement from the Food and Drug Administration and the United States Department of Agriculture, and our Secretary of Agriculture basically throwing down the gauntlet with the rest of the world, Sonny Perdue, and saying, we want the United States to be the leader in alternative proteins, and we're going to create the regulatory environment that makes that happen. And then probably really the biggest watershed has been on the corporate side, from startups and investors all the way up to the big, massive food conglomerates. Everybody is getting involved in alternative proteins. On the startup side, 5 years ago, right now, there were 3 companies named on the cultivated meat side, but only one company had raised any money at all. It was Memphis Meats. They'd raised $125,000. So that was the sum total of investments into cultivated meat 5 years ago. Now you have more than 60 cultivated meat companies. The plant-based meat side is going gangbusters. The fermentation, both precision and whole biomass fermentation side is going gangbusters. You have literally all of the biggest food companies from ADM to Nestle and all of the biggest global meat companies invested in alternative proteins and really recognizing this as a transformation rather than a disruption. It's very exciting.
Thank you, Bruce. Very well done. Okay, so Gustavo, I'm going to go to you next. You also have 3 minutes on the board. The rapid rise of the sector in Brazil is a fantastic case study. I say this all the time, especially for India, of what is possible in new markets for alternative protein. Could you tell us a little bit about how the sector took off so rapidly in Brazil?
Sure, thank you, Varun. You are right about how fast this was. We had our first meat analog to be started being selling in Brazil in May 2019. So it was a little over 1 year ago. And now we have almost all the largest meat companies working in the sector, the largest food companies, the 5+ startups, and Brazil is already selling plant-based products for more than 10 countries, exporting from the production in here. I would say there is a number of factors that is influencing this. First thing is that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. A lot of the technology is already developed in other countries, so we don't have to start the research from the scratch. We can just learn from what was developed in the other countries. The second thing I'd like to mention is the fact that Brazil has the consumption of meat. So we have one of the largest per capita meat consumption of the world, and this is the kind of products that we are creating for people that are meat lovers, people that like that taste, the smell, the texture, and therefore there is the kind of products that will perform well in the countries that have this reception for meat products as well. And especially, I would say one of the most important factors that we have now is the fact that we had already a very established food industry. So we have the largest meat companies of the world, and we were already selling these products, meat products all around the world. So now we are just creating a new line of product, putting the same truck, putting the same ships, and just shipping this everywhere. Brazil has the crop production that is being the raw materials to be used in this industry. We had a lot of food science. So somehow it's the same elements that existed in the other countries. We had science and people who know how to formulate and how to create new food products. We had the industry that was already established and with large distribution and the capacity to sell all overseas and all over the world. And we had consumer in the last part of this. Now, I would say the government is starting to look at this with more attention, and with some government incentives and the right taxes, the right way to develop this country. I would say Brazil has the ability to be the largest plant-based meat production of the world. And I don't want to be here teasing all my friends from all around the world, but I think this is a goal that we are working with. And I really believe that Brazil will be selling these products all over the world in a very short period of time. So it's pretty much taking the technology that already existed and plugging in a food system that was very, very well established, and that Brazil was already very recognized for it. Thank you. I will give you back 9 seconds.
Thank you. Thank you for the 6 seconds. And very well said. And I believe you, Gus, because it's been fantastic. I mean, March 2019 until now, it's been, to use Bruce's word, absolutely gangbusters. I'll go to Richard, 3 minutes on the clock. Richard, the EU is a very developed market for alternative protein. I mean, quite similar to the US, more diverse, of course, but quite similar to the US, and also some key differences across, I would say, regulation, civil society, etc. What would you say are the pivotal areas of focus for alternative protein growth in the EU today?
Thank you, Varun. I think that there are 4 key areas of focus, or certainly 4 areas that here at GFI Europe we're particularly focused on. Firstly is ensuring that governments, as Bruce was describing, really get behind alternative proteins in a big way. The European Union centrally and national governments across Europe invest significant sums every year in promoting research and development in order to deliver public policy objectives on things such as climate change, health, economic growth and prosperity, job creation, etc. At the moment, and as you say, Europe does have the beginnings of a strong market for alternative proteins. At the moment, governments, although there's been some tentative and encouraging exploration, aren't investing at nearly the scale or the size that they could be and should be. And so engaging with policymakers to encourage a boost in investment is a critical focus of ours. Secondly, and very importantly, is ensuring that alternative protein products can successfully come to market, particularly in terms of cultivated meat and other proteins, and ensuring that there is a fair, evidence-based, science-based path to market. We're lucky in that the EU has a world-leading regulatory regime, a robust regime. And that offers us encouragement, but ensuring that things are done in a properly science-based way is going to be key for the long-term trajectory of the sector in Europe. Linked to that, and thirdly, there's the issue of labeling. And as we've seen in other parts of the world, there are some moves afoot from very small corners of interest groups sometimes to want to restrict the accurate labeling of alternative protein products. So moves to restrict phrases such as burger or sausage, for example. These long used and very widely recognized descriptors. We've got a little bit of a fight on our hands at the moment to ensure that they can continue to be used. I'm confident and I hope that we will prevail on that. And then finally, and very briefly, a fourth key area of focus is engaging with civil society and other actors across the climate, health, other sectors to ensure that there's a broad coalition of support to speak out in favor of alternative proteins across Europe.
Thank you for that landscape, Richard, and very well said. Elaine, I'm going to put a very, very simple question to you. 3 minutes on the clock. Asia is an entirely different proposition altogether, with a more nascent market across actually all of these markets in Asia and unique consumer considerations. So my simple question to you is, what is special about Asia in terms of history and the current state of alternative proteins?
Oh yeah, that's a very simple question. I'm glad I have 3 minutes, long 3 minutes to answer that simple question. Okay, to start with, Asia is not homogeneous. I think that's the main thing, right? So it consists more than 40 countries, different cultures, languages, political structure, income levels, etc., etc. So I think the biggest challenge for anyone trying to venture into the Asia markets, and especially in a nascent sector like alternative protein, is to figure out where do you even begin. And once you've decided which specific country, market, segment you're trying to look into, the devil is then in the details. Whichever market you choose in Asia, I think the important thing to remember is that these are extremely old cultures. So Varun, you have the same challenge in India, right? It's a 4,500 year of food culture. Chinese culture is 3,500 years old. Japanese culture is almost 3,000 years old, and so on and so forth. And that's Asia. So I guess that gives you some perspective as to the complexity and why consumers tend to have more sophisticated or like particular palates as compared to many other markets around the world. So nuances include, for instance, meat isn't always the center of plate. And when it is, the whole animal, whether it's a chicken or a fish, is actually presented and consumed as a whole. And consuming all parts of an animal and internal organs of an animal is very much the norm, etc., etc. So yes, it is an entirely different expectation and proposition altogether. I would add though, other than looking at the markets potentials only, actually a lot of the opportunities that lie in the upper stream, which is to look into growing crops and other raw materials that can supply to the alternative protein sector and processing these raw materials, R&D, creating intellectual assets, this one is certainly the game that countries like Singapore have to play. So these are all extremely important parts that go into the supply chain that many Asian countries may play a big role in and ultimately have a big impact in scaling up and lowering the cost of production of these products, whether it is then consumed in or outside of Asia.
And you've managed
I'm
to,
so on for 3 minutes.
And you've managed to do it in like two minutes and 15 seconds. Wow, thank you so much. Near 3 minutes on the clock for you. Israel is a cradle of all protein innovation. We've seen it during the summit and all the time, and entrepreneurship as we've discussed. So would you please highlight for us your top priorities at GFI Israel and how you're leveraging this strategic advantage that you have in the country?
Yeah, sure. So as you know, our focus here is mostly on accelerating science and innovation. Israel is already one of the most advanced alternative protein ecosystems in the world, mostly when it comes to research and innovation, right? We have a very small market. We do enjoy governmental support. We have a very supportive market. Currently, we have over 50 startups in alternative protein in Israel, but we still lack enough innovation, scientific, and entrepreneurship to supply the market demand. There is so much demand for investment in Israel and worldwide that is coming to Israel. And I think here in Startup Nation, as we like to call ourselves, we are really well situated for this challenge. And this is why here in GFI Israel, what we are focusing on is the link between academic research and innovation. And as you know, sometimes it's really difficult to take an academic research and make a company out of it or attach it to an existing company. We are lucky to have a pretty robust system in Israel with the universities and their technology offices, which help us do it. One great example is Aleph Farms, an Israeli startup that make cultivated steaks. Their CEO, Didier, appeared in one of the previous sessions in this conference. And I think it's a great example. We have many more opportunities in the pipeline from universities such as the Hebrew University, Tel Aviv University, and the Technion. So a lot of innovation that can come out from GFI Israel to support this global challenge. And I will give you a minute and a half back.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you. And one of the major hallmarks, I guess, of Israel has been innovating under resource constraints. And you've just done that, Neil. Thank you so much for giving me an entire half of that time back. Elaine, I'm going to go back to you because many alternative protein leaders have identified Asia, broader Asia, but especially China as their next frontier for alternative protein growth. How do you think the markets will evolve in terms of global leaders entering them or local entrepreneurship springing up to address these needs?
So there are indeed a lot of exciting development in the news. Everybody has been reading, I think, especially over this year, the past 10 months or so in Asia. So I won't repeat those. Let's talk about sort of more insights. Since we only have 3 minutes, let's just take China as an example. So let's focus on China. I think for global brands trying to make it in China, the challenge is the cultural shock. So selling alternative protein in the West, right, you would go for the sustainability narrative, the animal welfare narrative, the overconsumption, not good for your health kind of narrative. In China, state-imposed food rationing system actually only phased out in the 1980s. So that's not actually that long ago. So imagine how the narrative of overconsumption would actually go with these people who actually just started enjoy being able to afford animal products as part of their daily diet. So there are many such nuances that global brands just need to understand and therefore then position themselves effectively in a market that is completely different from, let's say, the US. I do believe, however, that it is essential for global brands to break into this market. And this is because mock meat has actually existed for thousands of years in the Chinese food culture. And vegetarianism has an extremely strong association with religion. So much so that it's not cool, it's something that all people do. Like it's that image baggage is so heavy that it doesn't help with the 2.0 narrative of alternative proteins. So, however, with brands like Beyond Meat breaking into the Chinese market, that brings a completely fresh perspective into the alt protein. It's basically rebranding mock meat into plant-based meat. And that gives it a completely different kind of possibility and a different audience, and they would be consuming these products for a completely different reason. Now, for local entrepreneurs, the existing 1.0 products in not just in China, but I think in Asia in general, are actually not that bad. So what I see as the unique challenge, but also opportunity, is that local entrepreneurs should not take the shortcut and put old wine in new bottles. That's just super important. We are seeing rise of local entrepreneurs, some really promising one, but they really need to commit themselves into innovation and making better products in order to survive and thrive. So outside of China, we've been seeing many brands like Omnipork from Hong Kong, some brands from Japan and South Korea as well, that are very, very promising. But I think ultimately, right, better products would get you the consumer that would be better for the sector as a whole. And we just have to go for it. All the entrepreneurs, like, try your best to really innovate and create something better.
Thank you, Elaine. I love all of that. And it's so analogous to India in so many ways. The consumption being associated with status thing. I mean, government imposed rationing in China for that. There was no supply of chicken in India. And so people had to line, or even for dairy, people had to line around the block to get their dairy that was available, only eating chicken on Sundays, etc. So it's very, very similar here. Richard, you've spoken about how a major component of your work is regulation and getting the EU and national governments to focus on research funding. You've also said that perhaps they're not doing as much as they could. So could you lay out why this is important? What's the theory of change for why getting the EU to fund billions in smart protein research will advance the entire industry?
Yeah, absolutely. The theory of change and the reasoning is very simple, and it's a simple public good argument, which is the constraints which collectively the sector faces to get to price parity or better, and good taste and even better than conventional animal proteins. A lot of the scientific challenges which are standing in our way are ones which, if solved collectively, will advance and will spring out, allow the entire sector to spring out and to succeed. And it's absolutely critical that in addition to the private investments which are going into private IP, private intellectual property in Europe and globally, that is accompanied by public open access research. That's a key theme of the work that GFI does when we're funding research. And it's also a key thing that we're asking for governments to do. And the historical kind of parallels here are clear, and I think everyone's familiar with the example of all of the. It seems like all of the key technologies, say, of like the mobile phone in our pockets, such as GPS, some of the a lot of the electronics, etc., used. A lot of that springs, for example, from NASA investments in basic science and beyond in the 60s and 70s, etc. And we need to see, literally, our ask and our objective is to see literally a set of moonshots. It's for governments in Europe, but also globally, also government of India and governments globally, of course, to take moonshots, to see the case for public investment in this space on a par with the urgent need for investment in clean renewable technology, for example. We're all familiar, I'm sure, with the proportion of greenhouse gas emissions which are linked to conventional industrial animal agriculture production, etc. And we want to make the public policy case. We want to elevate this sector onto a level with the need for investment, say, in renewable technologies from governments. And it is that scale and that nature of open investment from governments globally which will really take this sector to the next level and allow it to deliver the environmental, the public health, the commercial benefits which it has the potential to offer.
Thank you, Richard. It's absolutely critical, inspiring work, and I love it. It's going to catalyze a space race for smart protein, as Bruce said. Neer, as you've mentioned, Israel is incredibly influential as a technology and entrepreneurship hub, but that influence also extends globally, right? So how is GFI Israel thinking about advancing the entire global market through your work in Israel?
Yeah, so obviously it's a very, very small country, especially when compared to India, for example. Israel's ability to impact the global market is only through groundbreaking science and innovation. And that's exactly what we want to do here in GFI Israel. That's our vision. And a lot of things are already happening. What can we do to accelerate the market? I think the answer is, one of the answers is to connect our different communities. And now it's a great example for our audience to see where GFI is spread and what we can bring to the table. And I'd like to give one example for that, a very specific one. And this is the Israel-India Fund, which is a bilateral agreement between the two countries that actually funds up to 50% of joint R&D and pilot projects between the two countries. So, for example, if two companies from India and Israel want to work together to collaborate, either for the development of new products or processes or technologies, they can apply for this fund. And I think the team might be sending the link right now to the audience, or perhaps later in the email. But let's think of one example is perhaps an Israeli fermentation startup or a cultivated meat startup. They can collaborate with an Indian pharma company, for example, on thinking of how to scale fermentation processes. That's one example. The fund also funds projects by two companies to work on the adaptation of products to local markets, the Indian market, for example. So we can take the very high quality products of Nestle in Israel in alternative protein and try to see how we can adapt them to the huge Indian market. And again, so that's an opportunity to get up to 50% of governmental funding in both countries. The deadline is December 12th. And feel free to reach out to either GFI Israel or GFI India's team to learn more about how we can collaborate in really doing this.
Thank you, Neer. Yeah, and this idea of what we've been promoting with these smart protein corridors across these geographies are going to be critical, especially with the Israeli ecosystem. The ambassador, His Excellency Dr. Ron Malka, spoke about this at our summit last year as well. And as Neer mentions, we'd be happy to collaborate and help people to bridge this gap and work with Israeli companies to apply for this. Gustavo, you mentioned that there are a lot of crops that you're growing in Brazil, or that Brazil grows, that can be applied. And all the knowledge about these crops can be applied within alternative protein. You've recently begun to work with the regional government of the Amazon state to map out biodiverse species, both plants and animals and seafood, etc., in the Amazon, and utilize this as an engine of all protein innovation. How would you say biodiversity plays a major role in advancing the industry? And what can you tell us about this exciting project?
Yeah, so the deforestation, especially on the Amazon region, is something that is part of the plant-based industry talking points for a while. But we got to a point where we realized that it's not possible to save the Amazon rainforest just by selling burgers in California and in the Netherlands. So in order to save the forest, we need to actually be working in the forest and where the deforestation is actually happening. Today, 70%, that's more than half of the deforestation in the Amazon region, is being caused by the expansion of the cattle raising. And the question is very complex because it will take a while until the plant-based industry naturally replaces a big portion of the traditional industry, so we can actually stop deforestation and the growth of the factory farming in the region. So now what we are thinking and how we can actually plug the biodiversity of the Amazon to the plant-based industry. We still have a lot of new ingredients to discover to give you flavor, color, protein, and these ingredients, they can be found in the traditional florists. So we have this financial stimulation to keep the florist alive. This is the kind of projects that we call the standing florist. So we need to find an economical activity for the area that is actually more profitable than just cutting the trees, selling the wood, and putting cattle in the place of this florist. And this is something that Brazil already have developed other very successful cases. One of the 5 largest cosmetic companies of the world now is a Brazilian company that made all their products based on the Amazon biodiversity. So the number of ingredients that we have there and then can be used by food is amazing. And I truly believe that's also one of the most unique capacities of Brazil. So we need to think like what we can do different from everything that's already happening in the world in order to differentiate the products that are being produced in Brazil. That's exactly the case from cosmetics. You know, they are different because they have something new. And then I can imagine a Brazilian native ingredient being sold to the whole world and making products even more competitive. Think that you are going to buy a product in Whole Foods in the United States and you see that there is a Brazilian plant-based meat in here that if I buy, I will be helping poor communities in the Amazon region, being socially fair to this production and also helping to save the Amazon forest. This is a big differential of the products. So that's why the whole industry is now trying to find new ways and new products and ingredients that can be developed in the Amazon region using the Brazilian biodiversity. Not only the Amazon, but also the Cerrado, the Atlantic forest. We have a few biomes in Brazil that can be part of the plant-based industry as very innovative and high-quality ingredients.
Thank you, Gustavo. And it's a fascinating, really fantastic model that you're working on there, which can be an example to other people in the rest of the world as well. Bruce, I'm going to go to you, still 3 minutes on the clock. At the point we are now, I think many would say the industry is up and running. I mean, you said it in your first answer, but there's plenty to be done still, right? There's plenty to be optimistic about, but there's plenty to be done. So what would you say are some pivotal inflection points, some milestones, which would make us say we're definitely on the right track over the next decade? You're on mute.
We are very early in our trajectory, as you know, so signs are very, very good, but the holy grail, the way that we actually replace the products of industrial animal agriculture is we need alternatives that taste the same or better and that cost the same or less. And we're very optimistic that we're going to get there, but there's still, I mean, there's not a cultivated meat product on sale yet. The plant-based meat products in the United States, the Impossible and the Beyond Burger, generally cost about 30% more. So we have work to do on the efficiency, on the scale up, on the price points. You look at something like renewable energy or the various other environmental endeavors, and they have required significant government investment in order to make them successful. They've required government investment on the private industry side, so incentives to make sure that the startups and larger companies are successful and that the product introductions are successful. They have needed policy support as well as what the Secretary of Agriculture in the United States was talking about, creating a regulatory framework that is welcoming for these new food technologies. And they have required that corporations see these things as opportunity rather than as threat. And the signs are good, but even in the United States, plant-based meat is less than probably 0.5% by volume of industrial animal meat, maybe just north of 1% by sales of industrial animal meat. Globally, it's even smaller than that, maybe a little bit higher in the UK and some parts of Europe, but lower in other parts of Europe and lower everywhere else in the world. So the progress we've been seeing is very good, but we need to see more cultivated meat companies raising their Series Bs. I think we have 2 so far, as well as C and D and E. So following the trajectory of Impossible Foods or the trajectory of Beyond Meat, we need to see more government funding. We've seen $3.5 million from the United States a couple of weeks ago, but that needs to be followed by tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of dollars more. We need to see other governments funding open access science in the same way, that sort of space race for food that we were talking about. So yes, there is an awful lot of reason to be optimistic, but it's a tall order, products that taste the same or better and cost the same or less. And that's what we need across the spectrum of products in order to really make the positive mission impact that we're going for globally. And it needs to happen around the world. And you're hearing a lot about optimistic reasons to be optimistic, but there is certainly a lot of work to be done.
Thank you, Bruce. And I think it goes to Richard's point from earlier as well about every technology, the cell phone, all of the stuff that we use has been supported greatly by governments and other open access research first before it was able to really come to market in a big way. Near on that note of the inflection points, the milestones over the next decade, where do you think the global and the Israeli alt protein market will be at the end of this decade in terms of market penetration and science? And we're staying at 3 minutes on the clock. Go ahead.
Yeah, great question. As you all know, if you've been here for 5 days, then projections say that the global alternative protein market can reach up to 10 or 20% of the global meat market in a decade. That's a huge, huge opportunity, right? We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars per year of a market that's developing in less than a decade. I do think it's a very realistic assumption. If we take a look at Israel as a relatively advanced alternative protein market, then we already see that in certain categories, we are already reaching those numbers, and mostly in dairy categories, but we're reaching there in plant-based meat also. I think that, you know, a decade is a very long time. A lot can happen. One thing that COVID is teaching us is that alternative proteins are actually developing faster in times of crisis. We see that alternative proteins have a very resilient manufacturing system. We see that they are better in terms of health, price, sustainability. So even if the next decade is going to be full of challenges, I think the more challenges we have, the faster alternative proteins will develop thanks to all of the benefits it brings with it. But in order for it to happen, we also need to see a lot more scientific advancement. The technologies we have at hand right now are not enough to cater the world's needs. And we need to see it across all technologies. I think the main points for innovation are, of course, lowering the price and doing better in terms of taste and quality, even though we're getting better at those, but we need to do more. One global challenge is to cater to the global palette of taste and characteristics of the local food markets. One thing that I'm seeing here in Israel is that people are developing foods to cater the Israeli or the American taste, right? It's very difficult for entrepreneurs around the globe to understand what kind of taste people like in India or in China. If you go in Israel to eat Indian food, I'm sure it's very different than what you can have in India. And I think one of our jobs is to really help entrepreneurs understand what are the specific needs in every geography that we work in order to assist the market, to accelerate the market in reaching those numbers very soon.
Thank you, Nir. Richard, Nir just mentioned that the range of projections for growth in alternative proteins is about 10 to 20% is what people say in terms of market penetration. The growth numbers that people are showing, or the market size numbers, is anywhere from $70 billion to $400 billion. The reason it's such a big window is, I think one of the biggest factors is regulation, right? So if there is favorable regulation, we'll be on this end of it at about 400. If it's not, then we might be at about 70 billion. And that's the simple truth. Could you paint us a picture, of just how key sensible regulation in the EU and across the world will be in stimulating this industry?
Yeah, I think it will be very important. And the key here, I think, is to strive and for policymakers to work to deliver rational and evidence-based regulation. You know, what people eat and what people put into their bodies matters a lot. And it's absolutely right that governments around the world pay close attention to ensuring the the quality and the safety of that. And that's critical if we are to reach the numbers that you describe. Even the lower bound, that is conditional on the public and on consumers trusting and embracing these products. Now, we know that the benefits of alternative protein products versus the counterfactual of conventional industrial animal agriculture products are very strong and should make food regulators around the world, as it were, lick their lips in anticipation. You know, and we're familiar with the very serious public health challenges that conventional protein unfortunately has got a history of delivering in terms of foodborne illness, salmonella, fecal contamination, etc., etc. And alternative proteins have got the potential, the strong potential, to be able to meet global demand for protein in a way which is literally cleaner and significantly safer than conventional animal products. At the same time, clearly, and you know, it varies slightly, well, very significantly according to the different categories of alternative protein we're talking about here. In terms of cultivated meat, that is something that regulators absolutely will and should want to assess carefully. And you know, the key there is to ensure that that assessment is made in a rational and evidence-based and a science-led approach, so that all of the appropriate studies can be conducted, the you know, the relevant and the required assurances can be given. But it is critical that it is done in a science-based way. And that once those scientific hurdles are cleared, that there is a clear path to market, and we need to watch and to make sure that the regulatory discussions around this really are fair and sort of technocratic in many ways, and to ensure that there's no attempted politicization of what should be and what must be a science-led regulatory approach.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Evidence-based and so importantly as well, consumer-led to a certain degree, because many consumers are demanding these products and are showing that they have no issues with the labeling and things like that. I'm going to go to you, Elaine, on the subject of regulation, because many have said, including Josh Tetrick in the keynote on day one, that cultivated meat and other categories may launch in India first. Why is this? What is it about I guess, the political economy or the regulatory regimes that makes this possible? And what do we think is a plausible sequence of events over the next decade?
You mean may launch in Asia first, right?
Yes, yeah.
I think when people say that, what they really mean is just Singapore. So Asia is huge. I would love to be proven wrong if one day suddenly things are actually approved in China first. That has very different implication to like if it is launched in Singapore first. For now, what we're seeing, I think there is a strong basis for speculation that specifically for approval of the first cultivated meat product is probably going to happen in Singapore, because the Singapore Food Agency is, I would say, the most progressive regulator in the world when it comes to alternative protein. And I think it is because Singapore is in such a unique position to push this forward without any baggage. The fact that it doesn't have an economy that heavily relies on local animal agriculture industry, it basically doesn't exist in Singapore. And it has everything to lose from not developing alternative protein, because that would hurt its food security, and it would mean that it's going to fail on its national policy goal to get to producing 30% of its own food by 2030. At this point, it's importing 90% of its foods. So I think it, from a regulatory perspective, obviously is very, very complicated, and politics, everything would play into it. But at this point, I'm seeing a small country like Singapore that can be very nimble about this, and because of its unique position, it is very likely that it will be a pioneer in terms of regulations. And our hope, of course, is that this would actually trigger a sequence of events. Then other Asian countries would look to it and want to stay competitive, and the fear of missing out. Money makes the world go round, and And then that would actually get everyone to feel like, oh my God, like I have to push this faster because I don't want to be the last one. I want to be the early movers instead of the last one in the game and missing all these opportunities. So hopefully that would be a good trigger, and ultimately the whole sector can benefit from this competition amongst countries, and therefore then accelerate this whole sector together.
Thank you, Elaine. I'm going to give Bruce the last word in my list of questions, and then I'm going to ask if you have a message for our audience, all of you. But finally, Bruce, what does our food system need to look like in 2030, and how do we make sure that we succeed? 3 minutes on the clock. Simple enough. Go ahead.
I mean, I want to underline something that Richard and Elaine said in sequence. So the first thing is the external costs of the way that we are producing meat right now are colossal. And we can make some positive changes at the edges, but at the end of the day, consumers want products that are delicious and that are reasonably priced. And for most people, meat qualifies as that, and they are unlikely to spend more money on meat in order to not use antibiotics in meat production, or to have slightly less adverse climate impact, or to do other things that could be done to moderately improve the way that meat is made. We really do, if we want to address climate change, scientists now say it's a literal impossibility that we meet our obligations under the Paris Climate Agreement by 2050 unless meat production and consumption goes down. So what we absolutely need is governments recognizing that, for the same reason governments put billions of dollars into agricultural R&D, tens of billions of dollars into renewable energy initiatives, even pre-COVID, more than $100 billion per year into global health initiatives. Governments need to recognize that, for the same reason that Singapore sees its food security issues and is likely to roll out the regulatory red carpet for new ways of producing meat, making meat from plants or whole biomass fermentation or cultivating cells. Government should also be rolling out the regulatory red carpet and putting funding resources into open access science, as well as incentivizing innovation at the private sector level. And one reason that I think, in particular, the COVID situation may cause both corporations and governments to look at this a little bit differently is the United Nations Environment Program just in July released a report about how we prevent the next pandemic. And it listed 7 things that might cause the next pandemic. The first one was animal protein consumption writ large, because of course this is zoonotic diseases. And the second is the industrialization of animal agriculture. So there's an inherent risk when you're raising animals for food that they might get sick with a zoonotic disease that jumps the species barrier. But once you depress their immune system by cramming tens of thousands of them or hundreds of thousands of them into sheds, that even goes up. So corporations that are interested in having better sustainability and global health metrics, and governments that are interested in better sustainability and global health metrics, should really be going all in order to create this food revolution. Everybody on this call, if you're here, you are prioritizing this, and kudos to you. GFI is a resource to you. If you're not already part of the GFI ecosystem, please check out gfi.org, go to the resources page, and we have a ton of stuff for scientists, for innovators, for investors, for corporations across the spectrum, for policymakers, to help us help you be a part of what it really is going to be the next agricultural revolution. Awesome job on the conference, Varun, to you and all of your team and all of the support. And thank you to everybody for prioritizing these issues, or if you're new to it, for taking them seriously. We hope you will jump in and get maximally involved.
Thank you, Bruce. Does anyone else have a message for our audience? We have about 5 minutes before we have to close out this session. You've all done very, very well on the timekeeping. I wish I had put this clock up for all the sessions of the summit. Richard, do you have a message for the audience about anything that's really important coming up? We have, by the way, a lot of students in the audience, a lot of really young people, Gen Z folks who are really interested across this 2,300 plus strong crowd that's looking at the summit. So if Richard, if you have a message for these folks, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, to my limited knowledge, when I think of India, I always think of great mathematicians and scientists, as well as economists and all of the other intellectual disciplines, chess players, etc. But I think that there is so much work so much exciting research and work that can be done for all of those categories of people, for scientists, scientists of all types, economists, entrepreneurs, etc. There is so much potential in this space. There's so much good work that needs to be done. There's so many problems that can be solved with ingenuity and talent. And it's fantastic to hear that there's large numbers of people watching this. And I think this is just an incredible and a very exciting opportunity, this space, for people to apply their careers and apply their time and their intellectual energy to tackling those problems. It's fun. It can be rewarding in all sorts of ways, and I think unleashing the talent which is watching this call could really make a big dent and accelerate things.
Thank you, Richard. Nir, any message for our audience aside from collaborating with Israel?
No. I want to tell the audience it's not too late. Many times I meet with big corporations, their boards, students, researchers, and they all feel like alternative protein has done so much, has gone a long way. It might be too late for them. What can they add? I want to tell everybody in the audience, we are in the very early stage of this thing. You should take a lot of attention and resources into alternative protein, especially if you are into food, if you are into sustainability, if you are into effective altruism. We are just in the early days of alternative protein, and yeah, you're welcome aboard.
Thank you, Nir. Elaine, any message for our audience? 30 seconds on the clock. Go ahead.
I love to speak to the students. I want to say from my personal experience, it is such an incredibly joyful thing to be able to dedicate your career to do something that is purposeful. I have spent like 15 years doing something that is not purposeful, and I killed that career and switched to this. Whether you're thinking about a second career, whether this is your first career, like really, this is something that you can do for yourself, the world. It's just so worth it. So yes, join this sector. We need more talents into this sector.
Thank you, Elaine. Gustavo, same question, 30 seconds, go.
Thank you, Varun. Congratulations for the event. I just want to point out that in order to replace something as complex as the animal production, we need to actually think on all the functions that it has in society, not only with consumers, but also with farmers and the people that today have a living with the animal raising as well. This today is 1/3 of the Brazilian gross domestic product, and it's actually millions of farmers that rely on animal raising to make their living. So my final message is that we always think on the developing of this market in a way that doesn't leave anyone behind, so that we can actually connect the plant-based and the cultivated meat and the fermentation industry to the farmers, to the communities that live in the forest, and to everyone else that is actually involved in the food production these days. So we can create a new system that is actually just and that's actually fair to the social environment and everything that we need to be and being better than the one that we are replacing.
Elaine, Gus, Nir, Richard, Bruce, an absolute privilege to be on this journey with you. Thank you so much for joining us at the Smart Protein Summit.
Thank you.
Thank you, Varun. Awesome job. Thanks, everybody.